As the Israel-Gaza war continues to develop, the nightmare scenario for some, and the fond hope for others, is that the conflict could spiral out into becoming a wider regional conflict. Biden administration officials are said to be alarmed that armed groups supported by Iran are gearing up to seize the moment and bring more deadly force to bear against Israel. That could end with Iran and the United States being drawn in and ending up in a direct conflict against each other. How likely do we think that is? Well, let's review the landscape. This week, Israel continued its gearing up to a ground invasion of Gaza in pursuit of its stated goal to render Hamas effectively null and void as a force on the ground. While it was doing that, the consequences for Palestinians of the cutting off of fuel, power, other supplies continued to mount. Various leaders from countries both sympathetic to Israel and hostile to Israel called for a ceasefire, a call which Israel supporters took as tantamount to declaring defeat in the face of the worst terrorist outrage the country has ever suffered. At least some of them were doing it, because it seems so likely that ground assault in Gaza will be the opening for a wider conflict, the progress of which could be very risky. The evidence for this is rather visible. Last week, the US Navy destroyer, the USS Carney, shot down 4 ballistic missiles and over a dozen drones that had been launched in the direction of Israel from Yemen. The Iran-backed Houthis are thought to possess missiles capable of hitting Israel, although it's not known how many they have. But the attacks are not only directed against Israel. Reportedly, United States forces across the Middle East, and specifically in Iraq and in Syria, have been facing a surge in attacks directly against them. US officials said that at least 24 US troops had been hurt in various attacks. Now, according to the news website Tortoise, these attacks may well be more extensive than the administration is currently admitting. It quoted one anonymous intelligence source as saying this: "The US is being very quiet about it for some reason, but from what we're seeing, the attacks against them have gone through the roof around the region." Indeed, according to that source, the Americans have had to evacuate around a dozen forward operating bases because they can't protect them anymore. Such attacks are thought to be coming from proxy groups tied to Iran, and the attacks are said to be relatively sophisticated. Their purpose so far seems to be that of testing defense systems, trying to understand what's deployed, what its capabilities are. Obviously, you test such things in advance of planned future action, unless, I suppose, what you find is sufficient to change your mind about the wisdom of such action. The US has been quick to respond, with 2 F-16 strikes against Iranian-backed militias in Syria near the Iraqi border. And herein lies at least one of the routes for a potential downward spiral into direct war. As Tortoise's source put it, most of the rockets being thrown at Israel from Gaza are low-grade. But the missiles Iran and its proxies have in Syria, Lebanon and Iran could seriously overwhelm Israel's defences. That would instantaneously trigger an American and wider Israeli response, and then you're looking at a full-scale war. That's not to say that anyone much started this process with that as an end in mind. If Iran and its best-armed near-at-hand proxy Hezbollah had been angling to provoke the latest all-out intifada against Israel, they probably would have joined in the initial attack, catching Israel at its weakest, most vulnerable moment, forcing itself to defend itself from 2 or 3 fronts at once. They didn't, and all the logic seemed on day one that this was less likely to expand into a wider war. Indeed, on the day immediately following the Hamas attack, when the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran had actively helped to plan the attack, both Israel and Washington were quick to deny that there was any evidence to support that contention. Iran also denied it, whilst of course happily celebrating the event anyway, but it reinforced the perception that they were not seeing this as the moment that they would emerge from the shadows. Iran has been finding its way through an economic crisis, as well as an internal challenge to its leadership from waves of protests. And then you look further afield, Arab states such as Jordan and Egypt have problems of their own, would want to be adding to them with vast waves of refugees coming from a war zone. The Gulf states want to focus their attentions on their ambitious programs for economic development, not opening the door to damaging regional stability. But their populations are a lot stronger in their reactions to events, and all of them found themselves needing to react, particularly when the hospital explosion took place, as we discussed last week. In spite of the widely shared evidence to the contrary, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates all attributed the blast to an Israeli airstrike. Furious protests were widespread. They dared not do otherwise, frankly, even had they been so inclined. And from that point, Iran started to harden its stance as well. In an interview with Al Jazeera 2 weeks ago, Iran's foreign minister said that it would be highly likely that, quote, many other fronts will be opened. Hezbollah, having engaged in a few localized, relatively token attacks in the first few days, has started to launch more sophisticated anti-tank missiles into the north of Israel. Civilians on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon border have been evacuating towns there in the expectation of plenty more to come. And this could be the major trigger. Hamas is well dug into its defensive positions in Gaza, but is relatively badly armed when it comes to weapons that can reach into Israel. Hezbollah, on the other hand, has a big stockpile of much more sophisticated weaponry. It has steadily been building up, fueled by Iran over the years since the last conflict. If it entered the war at full throttle, it could do a significant amount of damage and force Israel onto a very different scale of challenge to its position. Now, Iran to date had likely wanted to conserve Hezbollah's arms, kept its powder dry, if you will, to help deter direct assaults against it as it builds towards nuclear power status or nuclear weapons power status. But the wave of Muslim anger against Israel, passage of several weeks, may be leading it to see the Israel-Hamas war as an opportunity to degrade Israeli capabilities and to challenge America's convictions for its regional presence at the same time. It's notable, therefore, that Iran was present for the reception of Hamas representatives by Putin in Moscow this week. Tehran, of course, has cemented itself as a strong ally by providing Putin with drones and other support for the Ukraine war. And Putin has no doubt welcomed the instability in the Middle East, not least as a distraction for the world from what's happening in Ukraine. The other side of the equation, China, is a little more tricky, as it has a key interest in the stability of the region, which provides it with a large and steady flow of oil, but Xi Jinping is unlikely to be too actively disruptive to events that may weaken the position of the United States. All that said, in spite of the grievous blow to its prestige and apparent invulnerability, Israel still remains probably the dominant player. Hezbollah could hurt it for sure, as could Iran directly, but both probably realise that Israel remains capable of hitting them back hard, even at the same time as it pummels Hamas. So the question, Ben, is really how they think the long game plays out in the scenario where they get directly involved versus the one where they make token gestures to appease public opinion without actually lighting the blue touch paper. One of the factors that may play out is the likelihood that Hamas will almost certainly survive Israel's attacks in some form or another. After all, we've already seen this play. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was smashed and driven from Gaza way back in 1967. Not only that, it was then pushed out of Jordan in 1971, expelled from Lebanon by Israel in 1982. But the group was still able to go into exile, reconstitute itself abroad, and the PLO now runs the West Bank as the Palestinian Authority. So, while Israel talks up its intentions to Hamas in the deadliest, most terminal of terms, defeat is rarely as final as they would wish. Of course, what happens with Hamas may also hinge on the fate of the Palestinian Authority. Indeed, in the West Bank, fighting has started to emerge there, with some violent demonstrations, some reprisal attacks by some of the more aggressive Israeli settlers, because that's going to help. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is struggling to retain his legitimacy in the face of the aggressive approach by Hamas. And none of that is helped by the fact that he is a chain-smoking 87-year-old man who has actively avoided any kind of succession planning. In other words, there's soon going to be a vacancy with a huge vacuum surrounding it. Exactly the circumstances that often go to make a bad situation a whole lot worse. Please note, this has been a review and analysis of what seem to be the various factors and the evidence, considering how they might all play out. None of this is arguing who is right and who is wrong, nor how I personally would wish things to play out. This is analysis, not advocacy, and I mention it only because some in the comments seem to struggle with the concept that there's a difference between the two, and that if you say that something might happen, doesn't mean say you're arguing that you want it to happen. The avoidance of doubt as to which side I'm on, I am on the side of the Israeli and the Palestinian civilians who are desperately trying to survive the consequences of all of this so they can eventually reclaim some sort of relatively normal lives. The thing is that their ability to do that is far more likely to depend on the actions that certain groups and their leaders are making based purely on the strategic choices that they see in front of them, certainly than it will any random YouTubers emoting about it and campaigning for what turn out to be inevitably simplistic hot takes. So I try to focus on the former, not the latter. If you value this approach and think it adds value, then please consider becoming a Patreon supporter for this channel. I would be doing more of these videos per week if I were able, and that really comes down to the amount of support that the channel receives. Head on to patreon.com/Mallen Baker if you would like to add your support to those already there, or use the link in the video description to make PayPal donations. Either way, have a great week. See you soon.